So we added the header component, and of course that was a relatively easy step, a relatively easy task. But we're now going to dive a bit deeper, and we're going to continue with that second step where we'll add another new component, but now a component that will do a bit more than just output some text. We'll add a user input component, which job is to get the user input with help of two-way binding. And for the moment, that's then it. And of course, we also want to make sure here that we can submit the form that we'll need in this component so that we have this button that allows us to produce these results in the end. Though for the moment, we'll not derive those results just yet. Instead, right now, the idea is to collect that input and then maybe just output it in the console. So that's what I'll do here as a next step. So therefore, another new component is needed, and I'll generate it with ng-gc, and I'll name it user-input. And again, I'll skip the generation of these test files with the --skip tests command. With that, if I hit enter, this is created. This user input folder is added here next to the header folder. And as a first step, I'll start by bringing in those user input component styles, which you found attached earlier in this section. I'll replace the user input component CSS file with the one that was attached earlier. And we can now work on the markup of this component. And here in this user input component HTML file, I in the end want to have a form that outputs all these different inputs that allow us to collect the different pieces of data we need for this application. Now, for styling purposes, I'll add a div in that form with a class of input group. And in that div, I want to have a paragraph which then contains a label and an input element. That will be my first input here, this combination, which is about getting that initial investment amount from the user. So that's my label text, and I'll then add the for attribute to that label for accessibility reasons, and point at the element with the ID initial-investment, though of course no element has that ID right now, so I'll add the ID attribute to the input element and assign that as an ID, so that this label and input are connected through that assignment. Next, I'll add the type attribute and set that to number, so that this input focuses on getting numbers as input values, though from a type perspective, we'll still get string inputs, but the user will get better support with entering numbers, especially when visiting this page on mobile devices, for example. So that's a setting I want to set here. Now I'll copy that to add a second input below that input, or thanks to this class here, visually next to that input. And here that will get a label of annual investment, because this input is about getting that value that the user plans to invest every year. And hence I'll also change the ID here to annual investment. The type still is number. Well, and now I'm going to copy and duplicate this entire input group to add two more inputs, which also again will be positioned next to each other visually. And here in the first input of these newly added inputs, I want to get my expected return rate, and that should also be of type number. And I'll give this an ID of expected return, like this. And then here for the second input, I want to get the duration, and hence I'll choose duration here as an ID. Now, last but not least, at the bottom of this form, I want to add a paragraph which includes a button which says calculate. Well, with that, we should have the markup we need. Now we can go to the user input component TypeScript file and make sure that we link the template and style file there, which out of the box should be the case if you generated this with help of the CLI. I'm also using a standalone component here, but again, I'll show you module-based components later in this section. And I now want to output this user input component. Therefore, I'll go to the app component HTML file, and there, below my app header, I'll output my app-user-input component, or whatever you chose as a selector in this user input component TypeScript file. Here, that's the selector the CLI generated for me, so that's the selector we have to use here. Of course, again, this is not a known element just yet, so I'll take that quick fix and make sure that this import is added to the app component TypeScript file so that the user input component is registered there. With that, if you save everything and reload, you should see this user input area here below the header. And you should be able to enter some values here, so that should work. Of course, pressing the calculate button right now won't do anything useful though. Instead, it will trigger the browser default and submit that form to the server that serves this website, which is not what we want. So as a next step, I want to handle this form submission. So let's now handle the submission of this form. And for that, I'll go to my user input component HTML file. And there on the form, we can listen to an event about which you learned earlier in the Essentials section. We can listen to the ng-submit event. Or at least we almost can. Right now I can't, because this is not a default browser event. Instead, this is an event that's triggered for form elements by Angular, but only after we imported and unlocked, so to say, a certain Angular feature. To be precise, in the component that wants to use ng-submit, we have to add the forms module to our imports array here. And to make it available in this file, we actually also have to add the import at the top of the file from @AngularForms. This module includes a couple of important things. For example, an extension of the default form element, if you want to call it like this, that unlocks this ng-submit event. So now we can listen to that with that event binding syntax here. Now I also, of course, need to define what should happen when that event occurs. And here I want to add a new method to that user input component class. OnSubmit could be the name, though of course the name is up to you. And with that method added in the template of this component where we added the method, we can now call OnSubmit when that event occurs. So that's how we connect this. Now to see whether this works or not, inside of OnSubmit, we can console log submitted, for example. With that added, if you open the developer tools and there the JavaScript console, if you click calculate, now you should see submitted here. So that's an important step in the right direction. As a next step, I want to use two-way binding to get hold of the values that have been entered into these fields.